Freedom's greetings, Helldivers. Ervin here with a breakdown for the ever controversial R-36 Eruptor in Helldivers 2. This weapon has the most comedically long changelog in the game and arguably the most controversial one on top. After all those changes, however, it's come out of it with some of the most absurd damage per bullet in the entire game, even when compared to the support weapon class, and a heavy armor penetration buff to boot. But was it enough? Is the Eruptor finally in a class of its own, able to step out from the crossbow's shadow? Or is it still as irrelevant as the day it lost its airburst strike level shrapnel? Let's break down its stats, breakpoints, and target effectiveness against the three different factions to find out. Now, the Eruptor is probably the most complicated weapon in the entire game, with how many different mechanics it manages to bring together. But I'll be doing my best to cover each aspect of the weapon to the best of my abilities, one at a time, starting with the all important damage values. The physical gyrojet projectile of the weapon deals 230 ballistic damage or 115 durable damage with an armor penetration level of 4, also known as heavy penetration, which means the bullets deal damage to some of the toughest targets in the game, such as Charger armor, Titans, and Hulks through their faceplates. But the low overall damage of that bullet doesn't mean it's a replacement for the anti material rifle, which is still much better at dealing damage through hard armor. Although, unlike the anti material rifle, the gyrojet nature of the Eruptor's projectile means it experiences no damage fall off at range, similar to laser weaponry, although it does have a maximum range of 180 meters before a forced detonation occurs. While the Eruptor's capability against Class 4 armor isn't the greatest, it's important to take into account that it's impressive that it can contend with them at all, given it's a primary weapon, meaning it's among the very few weapons in the game that even have this level of penetration from the primary position. That Class 4 penetration also means it's doing full damage against medium armor instead of the 65% medium penetration would have, making it extremely deadly against medium armored targets. Doubly true due to the additional layers of damage that the Eruptor also piles on through explosive damage and shrapnel discharges. The Eruptor's projectiles deal explosive damage on impact in addition to the physical bullet, dealing 225 damage within a 4-meter inner radius to all nearby targets with an armor penetration level of 3, and 225 to 0 damage within the outer 7-meter radius with a reduced armor penetration level of only 2, better known as light penetration. This piles on a fair amount of extra damage for targets within the close range of the blast, but deals relatively insignificant damage to those that are further away, and no additional damage to Class 4 armor or higher. But that is, of course, not where the damage breakdown ends, as we now have to talk about the ever changing, controversial shrapnel aspect of the weapon. Every time the Eruptor's projectile impacts a target, not only does it explode, but it also fires 30 pieces of shrapnel out in a spherical area of effect around the impact site. You could say it's a lot like an eruption. The shrapnel deals 110 damage, or 35 durable damage, each piece with an armor penetration level of 3. So that means the shrapnel deals a potential additional 3,300 damage, bringing the total damage potential of the Eruptor up to a completely ridiculous 3,755, which, for context, is only less than the Spear missile system as far as damage dealt by a single shot. Or it would be if the shrapnel was reliable or worked the way you'd expect it to. You see, the Eruptor's shrapnel is set up in such a way that it phases through any targets around the projectile's point of impact, dealing 0 damage more often than not to the primary target. Meaning, that extra 3,300 damage from the shrapnel is, for the most part, completely cosmetic against the primary target if you actually hit them with your bullet, only dealing that damage evenly spread out to those within the blast radius, piling on a relatively small amount of additional AoE damage. This sphere of invulnerability around the projectile's impact site is one of the most gamified ways Arrowhead has ever balanced anything. And that's saying a lot because we're also still in the timeline where Alpha Commanders' heads are arbitrarily immune to explosive damage. This does mean the shrapnel is basically cosmetic against single targets, assuming you actually hit your shots, but can be manipulated to hit specific targets by ricocheting the shrapnel off the ground underneath your primary target, hilariously often doing more damage than if you'd have actually hit your shot, which is Really stupid, but that is how it works. So even if wonky to utilize, that's a lot of raw firepower for a primary weapon. So why is the Eruptor so underutilized if it's packing such an absurd amount of heat? Well, that's an easy question to answer because of everything else about it. The Eruptor has the worst fire rate in the game, beating out even the Blitzer for first place, sporting a lowly 25 rounds per minute. And no, I don't count the fire rate exploit into the overall balance of the weapon, meaning the actual DPS without the shrapnel is only 190 damage per second, 2 damage more than the Blitzer's DPS, and half as much as the Liberator concussive for some context. So if you're not getting good connections with the shrapnel by banking it off of surfaces or hitting targets in groups, the actual DPS of the Eruptor is among the worst in the game without exploits. The magazine capacity is an anemic 5 rounds with 6 spare magazines before needing a resupply, and the reload speed is also among the worst in the game on top. Reloading after 2.8 seconds with a tactical reload performed with 1 round remaining in the chamber, or an agonizingly slow 4.7 seconds if reloading from empty, meaning you really have to make your shots count and bring a reliable sidearm for when reloading isn't an option. The scope is a wonderful 4 times variable optic, at least, so we love that about it. But the ergonomics of the weapon are also the worst in the entire game, hosting the only negative value that I'm aware of at negative 14. Meaning fast target acquisition with the Eruptor is basically off the table entirely, only reaching tolerable levels when utilizing the peak physique passive to counter some of that extreme crosshair drag factor. The spread factor is also not great for a long range rifle sitting at a pretty high 10 MRAD. For context, that's about 1/4 the spread factor of the Reprimand and 20 times the spread factor of the Diligence Counter Sniper, making its accuracy at long distances a bit of a gamble when it comes to going for headshots with the projectile itself. On a high note, though, the Eruptor does have 35 staggering force on both its projectile and explosive radius, meaning its crowd controlling capability is fantastic, as it's able to lock down every medium or smaller enemy in the game in the event that the blast and shrapnel don't outright kill them. And the demolition force of the Eruptor's projectile is 30, meaning any direct connection with enemy spawners or even the Illuminate Tesla towers will lead to their immediate detonation. A fantastic utility for a primary weapon only otherwise held by its rival, the crossbow. Overall, the bolt action grenade rifle is a mixed bag of extremely goods and extremely bads, every stat taken to the extreme in either direction. Like someone maximized and minimized every slider on its character creation screen to create an absolute freak show. Strangely, that doesn't really reflect its effectiveness against the 3 factions due to its above average breakpoints. Abysmal fire rate and magazine capacity doesn't mean much if the target goes down in just a couple bullets, or in a lot of cases, an entire crowd of enemies in a single bullet. Against the automatons, the Eruptor has great applications, able to take down entire groups of devastators in just a few shots, and thanks to its staggering capabilities, keeps them locked up long enough to get off the second shot through that abysmal fire rate. Groups of troopers get annihilated by the very same blast, although keeping a secondary on hand like the dagger or talon for when troopers get too close to fire your Eruptor safely will prove wise. The Eruptor can also destroy factory strider guns in a single shot, decimate the weak points on tanks, cannon turrets, and hulks if you can find the angle. And although it doesn't give the most impressive results against hulks and the faceplates, the fact it can do it at all from the primary position is notable, in my opinion. Suffice to say, the Eruptor is an extremely powerful primary when it comes to combating the tin cans. Just be careful when firing into Devastator shields and maintain your distance from the blast zone, as that shrapnel can and will ricochet into your Helldiver. Overall, I give the Eruptor versus the Automatons a respectable 6 out of 10. It handles like shit, but it gets every job I could want it to get done. Against the Terminids, I can't really say the same. It's great for blowing up hordes of bugs, don't get me wrong, but the ammo capacity, fire rate, and literal negative handling stats really become a problem when your enemy is able to keep up with Usain Bolt. The class 4 penetration also gets no real value, as it's ineffective at taking down chargers and Bile Titans through their actual armor. It can, however, take out chargers in a reasonable number of shots to their butt, or by banking the shrapnel off the ground below their belly, a little known soft spot that only has Class 2 armor. The Eruptor is also a great bug hole closer, but being completely unusable once the enemy breaches your safe space has some serious flaws when it comes to this faction, requiring you to rely on the rest of your kit often to scrape the bugs off your back. And the firepower you get out of dealing with the clunkiness and poor utility stats of the Eruptor just don't feel worthwhile more often than not, in my opinion, giving it what I feel is a generous 5 out of 10 against the Terminids. It won't let you down if you build the rest of your loadout around it, but 9 out of 10 times you'd have been better off bringing the much more mobile and responsive crossbow to the party instead. Of the few Illuminates there currently are to use the Eruptor on, it performs pretty well. Hordes of Voteless get blasted into oblivion in a single pull of the trigger, Overseers get heavily staggered and can't fight back if caught within the blast radius, and can even be killed in a single well-placed headshot by the Eruptor's projectile. Although, with the terrible handling stats, that's going to be extremely difficult even with peak physique armor against the Hoverpack boys. Banking the shrapnel off terrain into their shields causes it to instantly decimate them, and it's a viable weapon for taking down harvesters, although you'll likely prefer to use just about anything else you'd consider viable against harvesters. As always, you will require a close range viable option in your loadout for when the enemy invades your personal space, but the Eruptor is definitely a workable option against the squids with the right loadout. Overall, I'll give it a 6 out of 10 that is very much carried by the joy it brings me when it turns hordes of voteless into paste. Overall, I would say the Eruptor functions as more than the sum of its parts, but man, does damn near everything about using the weapon itself feel bad, even if the results are good. Definitely would have preferred Arrowhead target buff some of the more quality of life stats, as making the weapon feel better to fire over giving it an armor penetration buff that in reality doesn't really factor into much of a difference overall would have been preferable in my mind. The Eruptor also struggles to overcome its greatest challenge, making more sense to use than the crossbow, as most of the merits of the Eruptor are the same merits as the crossbow, and the crossbow doesn't have negative handling stats. But what do you guys think about the Eruptor? Has Arrowhead finally fixed her, or is there still more work to be done somehow? Thank you for watching till the end, and thank you to my coffee supporters who help keep the channel going. I'll see you next time.